I have a message from the group of Maria Corina Machado because I've been in contact with them. She's the opposition leader. She's a good friend of mine. To the international media. They are really very upset by the way that the press in the Western world has been covering all this. And they have a double standard when it comes to left-wing dictatorships as compared to not left-wing or right-wing dictatorships. And you have several newspapers like El País in Spain, for instance, that have called Maria Corina Machado a far-right extremist, which is complete nonsense. She is fighting for freedom and democracy. And then you have other media like the New York Times who have been very biased as well. And they sent me a message, and I'm using this platform, and they thank you, Jordan, for this interview, because they need the support of the international community if you want a transition to happen in Venezuela, which is looking increasingly unlikely with the passing of time. So it's very sad, and this is poisoning the whole of the whole region. And also, I think it's gonna be a big problem for the United States if they don't push enough to get rid of Maduro right now, for the reasons I already mentioned.
All right, so there's a lot in what you just said. So let me take it apart piece by piece. You said, for example, that if you vote in the socialists, you don't get to vote them out. And so we probably want to draw a distinction, or at least have a discussion about socialism versus communism, or a discussion about whether or not that distinction is even reasonable. It's definitely the case that in some Western countries, more left-leaning regimes are voted in and voted out with some degree of regularity. Canada has a socialist party, the New Democratic Party, and it has never won an election federally and is unlikely ever to do so, I would say, because it never seems to gain more than about 20% of the population. But it's certainly run many provinces, and, often not cataclysmically, sometimes even intelligently, depending on who it was that was running the show, let's say. So, and then, of course, people tend to presume that countries like Sweden and Denmark and Norway are socialist countries, even though fundamentally they adhere to free market principles. So do you want to distinguish first for maybe some definitions? What do you think the difference is between a socialist country and a communist country, and how should people draw a distinction?
Well, I would distinguish between social democracy, which is, the left that we have usually in the Western world, in the developed nations, people like Biden, or people like, Justin Trudeau, people like that, who can be very far left when it comes to the woke issues and all of these value conflicts that we have now in the West. And I believe that they are responsible for endorsing an ideology that will end up destroying the West if they are successful in the end. But they are not these revolutionary socialists that we have now in Latin America, or that we used to have in the Western world during the Cold War. Like you had them in Italy and France, you had them in Germany, you had terrorist groups that were fighting against the establishment, being funded by the Soviet Union, and so on. So I would make a distinction there. And also, if you have countries with more solid institutions, even within Latin America, they are never able to achieve their goal of concentrating power in their own hands. Like Chile is a good example of that. We had a constitutional referendum a couple of years ago, and the left proposed a very radical constitution, a very woke constitution, but at the same time, communist constitution. And over 60% of Chileans voted against that. So we were saved by this decision in the referendum. So they failed in their attempt to, control power. So I would say in the classical definition, socialism and Marxism or communism, they used to be more or less the same during the Cold War. I mean, it would be hard to argue that a socialist was not at the same time someone who believed in the Soviet Union type of system, central planned economy. This is a point that Hayek and Mises were making during the Cold War, fighting against the socialists, because the socialists were arguing for a central planned economy, which in the end would have destroyed all sort of political liberties and democracy as well. So I would distinguish more, as I said, between the social democrats, and within the social democrats you have also more extreme type of people than others, and the socialists and communists. And even if some political parties have the name of socialist, nowadays they are more like social democrats than true socialists that are inspired 100% by the Marxist and Leninist doctrine that they followed in the times of the Cold War. So that's a distinction I would make.
So what we could say, just to clarify this further for everybody watching and listening, is that in countries like, I think the Scandinavian countries are probably the best example of this. The first thing we should note is that they're relatively small countries, and until recently they were relatively homogenous ethnically, and that makes governance more straightforward. The systems simply aren't as complex because there are fewer people, and there is more of a implicit consensus on which way is up and which way is down, let's say. But the Scandinavian countries like Canada, the classic socialists were really free market people, all things considered, believed in private property more or less, but were more interested than the libertarians or the conservatives in producing a broad and encompassing social safety net. And so most of the political action in Canada had to do with the expansion of the social safety net. And that was what the left-wingers and the labor union types were pushing for with a certain degree of success. And the distinction you're drawing on, and you referred to a couple of Austrian economists, Hayek and Mises, is that the communists go full-fledged planned economy, the full-fledged planned economy route, and they are not in favor of private property. They believe that an untrammeled free market, it ends up concentrating economic power in the hands of a very small number of people, and that replacing that with a planned economy would fix that problem, which it certainly doesn't and can't.
As a spouse, a parent, or a leader, people count on you. But if you're constantly tired, unfocused, and just not feeling like yourself, how can you show up the way they need you to? That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick is a premier health optimization platform that uses comprehensive lab work, not guesswork, to uncover what's really going on in your body. Hormones, thyroid inflammation, nutrient levels, the markers that matter. Their expert clinical teams build a personalized, research-backed plan just for you, whether it's lifestyle changes, supplements, or prescription treatments. When you know what's going on inside, you can leave with clarity, show up with energy, and stay sharp for your family, your team, and yourself. Head over to merrickhealth.com and use code Peterson for 10% off to join their guided optimization program with your personal medical team. That's merrickhealth.com, code Peterson. Stop guessing, start leading, and start with Merrick Health.
And I know the Austrians who you referred to also make the case that a planned economy is something that appeals to people who are very presumptuous in their intellect, because the fabrication of any given commodity, consumer item, let's say, or a commodity for that matter, is complex almost beyond, well, it's complex beyond comprehension unless you have a distributed system of pricing to make rational, intelligent decisions. Your economy will eventually grind to a cataclysmic halt.
Exactly.
So I think about it as a computational problem, right? Is that and I think this fits in very well with the Austrian economists' line of thinking, is like, do you want to have a distributed network of computation, each person calculating their own hierarchy of values, each person with the eyes on the particulars of their local situation, sum all that together in some distributed manner and allow decisions to be made that way? Or do you want to put decision-making power in the hands of a small group of people who can't hope to know what's going on? You know, I think the Central Committee, the Soviet Central Committee, was making something like 300 pricing decisions a day. And like, I've run companies where we've tried to price our offerings, and just pricing one thing is almost impossible. And you have to do that in concert with your market. You don't know what something is worth, the best you can do is find out what people are willing to pay for it, given all the other things that they're trying to accomplish simultaneously. So, okay, so the communist types, they're focusing on a planned economy. Now, let's go back to Venezuela. So before the socialist revolution took place, in your opinion, how was Venezuela doing?
So Venezuela is an interesting case because it had the highest per capita income in Latin America in 1970, and it was the country with the largest degree of economic freedom. You can measure that. The Fraser Institute in Canada does that work of measuring economic freedom. And in 1970, Venezuela was 14 in the world in terms of economic freedom. It was about like 90 countries, more or less, that they were measuring back then. Chile was one of the last countries because we had the socialist experiment of Salvador Allende, which was an attempt to impose a totalitarian communist system in Chile. And we were last in the country, and we had hyperinflation and scarcity of basic goods and services and so on and so forth. So it was a complete catastrophe that ended up in the coup of 1973, led by General Pinochet. But Venezuela, over time and over the decades, especially after they nationalized in the 70s the oil industry, we have to remember Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. They nationalized it, and they started falling in the ranking of economic freedom systematically. So by the time Chavez came to power in 1988, Venezuela was doing very poorly in the rankings of economic freedom. You had a very kleptocratic, corrupt system that, a rent-seeking society, let's say. Everyone was trying to live out of the government handouts and corrupt deals between the corporate interests and the politicians. And Chavez was elected. He had been a soldier who had attempted a coup in 1992 against Carlos Andrés Pérez. So he was a golpista, what we call a golpista in Spanish. So someone who tried to overthrow a democratically elected president and install a dictatorship. So everyone knew who Chavez was. Many people died in 1992, and he ended up in prison. But well-meaning central leftist in Venezuela pardoned him so he could go out of jail. And then he went to see Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro recognized immediately that he had, a puppet that he could guide in order to take control over Venezuela. So Castro and Cuba, they have been the masterminds behind what is going on in this country. And they have, extracted huge sums of wealth from Venezuela because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at some point, Russia stopped funding the Cuban dictatorship. And so Venezuela played that role. And Chavez saw in Fidel Castro a fatherly figure for him. And this is really an important thing because he was loyal to Fidel until the very end. And the intelligence services from Cuba, who are very effective, we have to say, in consolidating power. They have been there in Cuba for over 60 years, so they know what they're doing. These are the people advising the regime as to what to do to deal with the opposition and to purge the military and things like that. But Venezuela was already in a situation where they had lost their economic freedom, and the per capita incomes, as compared to other countries in Latin America, started to fall dramatically. And while Chile embraced free market reforms, especially influenced by the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman and Arnold Harberger, George Stigler, and people like that, and we became the wealthiest country in per capita terms in Latin America. And so you can see that in the 70s, Chile was at the bottom of the economic freedom ranking. We went up to the top, even top 10 at some point, and we became the wealthiest country in Latin America. And Venezuela, the complete opposite. They went from being the freest country in Latin America to now the last country in the ranking in the world, 162 among 162 countries that are measured. And it's a complete disaster. And this is socialism. This is what I mean. So the Nordic countries are really on the top countries in terms of economic freedom. These are not really socialist countries. And I remember Bernie Sanders saying this all the time, and he got a response. I think it was the prime minister from Sweden who told him, we are not socialists. You have corporate tax in Sweden that is lower than in the United States, more or less, in some of these Nordic countries. You have, so what they do is they tax very heavily personal income, right? And this is, I don't like it because you have lots of human capital flight, people who are very qualified who go to the United States or other parts. But still, they're very productive countries, and they have very large degrees of economic freedom. And economic freedom means free trade, stable currency, protection of property rights, reasonable size of government, and so on. So it is the social democracy, like Anthony Giddens type of social democracy, what Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were at the time at some point, or German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who made all the reforms in Germany, allowing Germany in the 2000s to then experience a boom, an economic boom that Merkel benefited from that. Okay, but here what we have is the extreme far left experiments that are very anti-capitalist, and this is what you see in Venezuela now is the consolidation of this ideology. We have to remember that Maduro was chosen by Chavez as his successor. And the reason for this was that Maduro, compared to Diosdado Cabello, who is another criminal and one of the main leaders of this Soles cartel, Maduro is a doctrinaire. He was the hardcore socialist. And he was foreign affairs minister to the Chavez administration. And he was instrumental in building up the whole network of Venezuela and the Chavismo on an international level, in Europe, in Asia, in different parts. And Chavez aligned himself very rapidly with Russia and with Iran and with China. So this is part of the Cold War 2.0 that we are experiencing. Venezuela is playing for them. And now we have, and I want to stress this, Jordan, because it's important. You have a minimum wage of $3 in Venezuela. You have accumulated inflation of 2 million% or more. You have collapse of 70% of GDP, 70%. You have a collapse of over 80% of oil production in Venezuela. And they have squandered almost $1 trillion in wealth, because when Chavez came to power, you had a barrel of oil at $8 or so. And it skyrocketed to over $120. So only because of that, they got almost $1 trillion. They destroyed all of that wealth. And people say, oh, this is, Caribbean type of politics. This is the result of socialism. Everywhere you go and you see what the socialists, when they implement this system, and again, I don't mean the Nordic type of welfare state, which is not socialism, not real socialism at least, they destroy the country where they run it. It's you can see it in Eastern Germany as compared to Western Germany during the Cold War. It was a very poor country compared to Western Germany, and so on. I mean, everyone knows the different examples: North Korea, South Korea, and so on and so forth. But it's important to remember that Fidel Castro, Cuba, and Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Iran, Hezbollah, are behind Maduro. I have to stress this because this is not only a Venezuelan problem. This is going to be a crucial problem for the United States and for national security in the United States.
Well, let's dig into that